have specific facts regarding the emergency room, her resuscitation, and even physical descriptions of the two physicians. Morse confirmed that a child with Katie's symptoms should have the absence of any brain function and therefore should comprehend nothing. Katie recalled these recent details for almost an hour. Further, during her comatose state, she said that an angel named Elizabeth allowed her to view her family at home. Katie correctly reported very specific details concerning the clothing and positions of each new family member, identified a popular rock song her sister listened to, observed her father, and then watched while her mother cooked dinner. She even correctly identified the food, roast chicken and rice, and later she shocked her parents by relating details from just a few days before. And this is one story in a collection of stories that Habermas has. One of the ones, Sean, you might remember, he talked about someone who was dead, no brain activity. Okay, so there's nothing going on. You're just basically kept alive. Your atoms, your particles are kept alive by a machine. And this lady was revived, came back and said, hey, there's a red shoe on the roof of the hospital. And they're like, what do you mean? Yeah, there's a red shoe. And this is like a doctor's report. And Habermas said he's called the nurses and talked to them in person. But basically, she had this out-of-body experience where she had like floated up to the roof and noticed that there was a red shoe. And sure enough, the surgeon, the main doctor of the thing, went up and found this random red shoe on the ceiling. And it wasn't a place, it was a place where you couldn't actually see it from another building. It was tucked away, right, underneath kind of like just the corner of this lip. But she saw this red shoe. So you have these bizarre stories like this, which I'm like, okay, if these are happening and people have all these stories, it seems to me like there might be something more going on here, that we have some sort of consciousness that exists beyond just the natural world. And for me, that indicates that, okay, if there's non-physical things going on, that to me gives me hope that, okay, there's some sort of afterlife going on. Okay, so moving forward, let's continue. When we talk about Christianity, the story that Jesus comes back from the dead, other things that I find are really helpful considering this are the reports, the historic reports by people who aren't Christians. And one of the more famous ones you will find, there's a guy named Josephus, who was a Jewish historian in Rome. So keep in mind that he didn't believe in Jesus Christ. He remained in the Jewish law, in Judaism. So he never converted to Christianity. But he writes this in a historic document that all scholars will say this is a legitimate thing, okay? In Rome in the year 93, Josephus published, or this would be AD 93, Josephus is his name, published his lengthy history of the Jews while discussing the period in which Jews of Judea were governed by Roman procurator Pontius Pilate. Josephus included the following account. This is what he writes. He says, about this time there lived a man named Jesus. He was a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Messiah, so they said. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross. Those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and thousands other marvels about him. And the tribes of Christians, so called after him, have to this day still not disappeared. And so what I see here is Josephus saying, there's no lie that there was a guy named Jesus. And from what I'm observing, I know he was killed because I remember that report. But I also remember the reports of all these people saying he's alive again, and he's appeared to me. And then I remember them actually continuing on and believing this. And then I also remember them being persecuted and killed for it and still believing it. Strange times we live in, Josephus. So that is another reason where I'm like, yeah, there might be more going on here than I would have originally thought. But now a skeptic would come and say, okay, great, that's Josephus, but I'm talking about other records because, look, the Bible's probably fabricated. because the earliest ones we have is 40 years after. Okay? You're going to trust a book that where they say these stories happened 40 years after, and that's us, the modern skeptic. Let me show you the various time gaps in other historic documents that we consider truth. Okay, we don't really question them. But I want to show you the time gaps and then show you the difference with the New Testament. Okay, so bear with me here. What I'll do is, are you familiar with Homer's Iliad? A famous kind of book, Homer's Iliad. So this is Homer's Iliad. Okay? It was written in 800 BC, so 800 years before Christ. And the earliest manuscript that they have found, okay, the earliest writing that they had found on it is 400 BC. Okay? So that means there's a 400-year time gap. All right? So the earliest one, we know it was written in 800 BC. Earliest one we have is 400 years later. Okay? Here's another one. Have you ever heard of the guy named Plato? Right? We accept his writings as pretty legit. Okay? So Plato, the earliest writings of his tetralogies, it was written in 400 BC. The earliest copy that we have of it, the earliest piece of writing that we have is the year 895 AD, which is a time gap of roughly 1,300 years. It's a large time gap. Here's another one. Caesar and the Gallic Wars is another historic document that people trust and say this is legit. Okay? I can never spell Caesar. It's the worst. Who spells like this? Caesar. All right, Caesar. His Gallic Wars was written in 100 to 44 BC, somewhere in there. Okay? The earliest manuscripts they have of that is the 9th century, which makes it a time gap, he says, of about 950. And I'm getting these numbers from Clay Jones. And this is in Andy's book. He discusses this a little bit as well. All right? I'm going to do one more for you. This is Livy, L-I-V-Y. Now, this is the history of Rome. It's a historic document, okay? The date written is somewhere between 59 BC and AD 17, okay? Somewhere in there, it was written. The earliest manuscripts that we have is early 5th century, okay? Which is a time gap of 400 years. So if I'm that skeptic, I'm going to come back and say, so you're going to say, okay, my book was written 40 years after, right, the New Testament, but yours is 400 years after. You can trust someone after 400 years, the earliest one we have. So that's where I'd push back against them. Let me just show you the New Testament, okay? So New Testament, most scholars will say, it was written from about 50 A.D. to 100 A.D. Now, this is the Gospels. This is also the writings of Paul, okay? And Jesus lived, they say he died, what, 33, Freddie? Somewhere around there. The Gospels are written a little bit later. They say in like kind of the 70s, 80, 70. But Paul's writings occur within a 10-year gap. So Paul, as a historic figure, is writing and ministering and doing all this stuff at this time. So let me just show you for the sake of this. It is written 50 to 100 A.D. And the earliest manuscripts that we have is A.D. 130, which makes the time gap 40 years. Now, added, they have enormous amounts of these manuscripts. So for some of the other ones, right, of the oldest manuscripts that they have, or the correct number, right? For Homer's Iliad, they have about 1,700 of like historic documents, with a time gap again of 400 years, right? That's still the oldest one. That Plato's work, the time gap was 1,300 years. They have about 210 copies of it. Livy, the history, right? History of Rome. They have 150 copies of it. You ready for this? New Testament writings, 5,795 copies, all saying the same thing around that time, which shows me that because, and again, one of the things that would have been recorded in the New Testament that puts it in this time area is they would have talked about the destruction of the temple, because that was a massive event, and it's never really mentioned. It's never mentioned in the New Testament. And so because it's not mentioned, it shows us that it happened before this historic event. And you can go to the ancient world and go to Israel. My parents were just there, and see this great fortress where the Jews had their final stand. Like, you can go there. So this is a legit thing. Scholars agree that happened. But what this shows us, as Clay Jones writes, he says, the sheer number of manuscripts as well as the consistency of them shows us that the text of the New Testament has not been corrupted over time. We can reasonably believe that we are reading what the original authors wrote. And the reason we can do that is because they will look at each one and cross-reference them, say, are they saying the same thing? And it shows that the message hasn't been conflated and changed. It was 40 years after, and they're all saying the same thing. As a historic document and as a history major, that is very telling. And that shows me there's a lot of weight here. These documents are serious and should be taken seriously. So, here's another reason, just a couple more, why I believe that there's life after death. Because the whole thing surrounds around Jesus. Did the resurrection happen? If you're going to fabricate a story, there's a few things that you wouldn't do. One of the things that you wouldn't do, especially with the cultural time, is include embarrassing details such as Peter denying Jesus. Okay, you wouldn't include that. You wouldn't include the Judas betrayal in a historic kind of document, like with the way they would write stories, right? It's very glorious. You wouldn't have Judas betraying him. And you certainly wouldn't have the disciples flee or have women find Jesus, that they find the empty tomb, right? Women were seen as lesser. And so you would have a strong man find it and say, the tomb's empty. But you don't. You have people who are marginalized and thrown to the side come and find the tomb and say this happened. And which that was kind of like an embarrassing detail for that time. Another thing that you get, too, is you get this story. There's a guy named Joseph of Arimathea who actually leaves his high standing and says, can I bury Jesus? And it's kind of embarrassing for him because he basically is leaving his career as one of the guys in the law, right? And maybe experiencing scorn from his peers and saying, I'm going to bury this guy, because he was kind of like a secret believer in Christ and believed him. There's details there that are telling. If you're going to make up a fake story, you wouldn't do it like this. But this also goes against the Jewish narrative of what they expected. If you read the Old Testament, they expect this military Messiah to come and just destroy all the people who are keeping them in captive, right? He's going to be this mighty, mighty man. We're going to have a revolution, which is kind of what ends up happening with the destruction of the temple. They try and raise up, the Jews do, and fight Rome. And, of course, no one beats Rome at this time. They're too strong, and so they beat back these Jews who have this revolt. But they're expecting this Messiah to come and be massive and do this incredible military victory. And yet, Jesus comes on the scene, and what he does is he doesn't bring this massive total victory. John the Baptist at one time says, are you the Messiah? Or should we be waiting for someone else? And some people say it's the time of doubt. I think partly it's that, where he's in prison. He's like, I'm kind of losing hope here. But also he's just confused. I thought we were going to get this massive victory. But Jesus, what he does is Jesus, and the unique thing about Christianity is Jesus comes, the first time he comes and basically says, I'm not here to provide that type of victory for you. I'm fighting the greater enemy, sin and death. And so when Jesus does his ministry, he does healings, and he teaches, and he builds himself up, fulfilling prophecies, living this perfect life. Then he dies. And then you're kind of left in suspense. But of course, the Christian story, he comes back to life. And when he does that, what does he do? He defeats sin and death. And that is the gospel message. When Jesus defeats sin and death, he's saying the relationship can be restored now. Because every one of you now, when you were going to die, you were going to be apart from me. But because I have defeated death, that relationship can be restored. You can know me, you can follow me, and if you believe in me, you'll be with me forever in paradise. The heart of Christianity is Jesus dying for his enemies. And Christianity says the one who is the author of life, who died but came back to life, you can know him. You can know the author of life. Jesus dying and raising to life proves him to be not only the defeater of death, but author of life. And this does two things. As we said in the beginning, we were created for community with God and community with people. When you believe in Jesus, you're believing and being restored back into community with God, relationship, and with people, with the church. And the emphasis and why we gather here is Jesus comes and he sets up this community and body of believers who are going to be people who can move through life together in community. You can know one another, support one another as you chase after God himself. 2,000 years later, Jesus had changed the world, and what he said is still being talked about, and it hasn't gone away. And based on kind of some of the things we've just touched on today, this is very, very basic. You can go real deep into this stuff. But my question is this. It still hasn't gone away. We haven't disproved the resurrection. Is it possible that Jesus was who he said he was? And that this story is true? With the non-physical, with history. Is it true? Is it possible that this Jesus is true? And I think it is. And based on some of that evidence, I'm like, yeah, I think it's true. And if it's true, it completely changes everything. Relationship with God, relationship with people. Restored relationship. Beginning in this time of what John Stott, a theologian, calls, we live in this place between two worlds, right? The world that is here and was bad, but then Christ redeemed it. And we know that he's going to come again. And we read about that in Revelation where he actually does come back as that conquering king, right? So the one that the Jews said, yeah, he's going to be a military Messiah. Oh, that's going to happen. But we live in this in-between time where we have each other, the church, this already not yet tension that we live in. But we walk through it together. And so in this life, it's not going to be easy, but because Jesus raised from the dead, it's life worth living. Because as we follow him and grow in relationship with him. So, Jesus' teaching describe a love that is life-giving now and a life that is to come. And so if these are true, these are worth taking seriously. And the invitation is this. Jesus invites you to come and know him. He defeated sin. He defeated death. And you can be in relationship with him again. And so all of this begs the question of, what are you going to do with the person of Jesus? Will you take him seriously? Will you follow him, as Peter did, and trust him, as Peter ended up trusting him and going to his own death? Is there life after death? I say yes. And you can know him. So that is it for me. We're going to move into a time of discussion. Hopefully some of these things got your mind going. Here's the questions. Let's talk about them. And then we're going to close the evening with a question and answer period.